Good afternoon, and welcome back after a long hiatus from the coronavirus. We're very fortunate to be in downtown San Antonio once again with San Antonio Public Access Television, and of course my show that I have missed for more than a year is World Peace. We are very fortunate to have as our first guest following our pandemic a gentleman that was born and raised in South Texas, and I'm going to let this person introduce himself. He's visiting right now San Antonio for a reason, to be here at this particular time of the year. Jose, please tell us about yourself, your how you got to Texas and how you returned to Texas. Tell us something.
Red, thank you very much. Thank you, and I feel great being in San Antonio, finally, with this COVID finally easing up. I've been waiting to come here for 2 years. Brett, I belong to an organization called Two Countries, One Lie. It's on my T-shirt. I think your people can see it. And what I have been doing for the last 7 years is going through Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, and I've been telling the truth about what really happened to the Spanish and Mexican land grants and our people. And what I've been doing is digging up the real story of not only places like the Alamo, but also the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo, and what really happened, like the King Ranch and Mifflin Kennedy Ranch and the Stillman Ranch, where these people all wound up taking and basically stealing the Tejanos' lands. But at the same time, there was injustices done to both sides of my people. There was the Tejanos that were their lands were stolen, and basically we were taken by surprise during the 1848 treaty. And at the same time, the Indians, the Mexican-American indigenous Indians, who we are. I call myself a Tejano because I've got 60% European blood, but I'm almost 40% indigenous. So does that make me any less indigenous than a full-blooded indigenous person? No, we have the same thread that binds us. We have the same blood that pumps through our veins. So when I speak for the Tejano, I speak for the indigenous also. A lot of indigenous tribes may not like that I'm speaking for them, but I speak on behalf of all of the indigenous people that aren't represented. And I think that the crimes that have been done against all of us need to be brought forth. If there's any thing to get out of this, is I'm going to divulge to you the real history, and not necessarily books like this about the Alamo and telling you how this is really a myth, and this is really nothing more than a white nationalist movement to keep the crown jewel in Texas. We are sick and tired, as being Mexican-American citizens, of being second-class citizens to this stuff. And the white nationalist movement is not going to be happy with what I say today, and I'm okay with that. They're allowed their opinion, I'm allowed mine. This is America. We're free, and we have the ability to have the Constitution to protect us. And that's why I brought these books today. We'll talk about them in a minute, Brett. But I brought the U.S. Constitution, and then I brought the treaty, which gives us rights above and beyond the Constitution. We'll talk about it in a minute. And then I brought this, the Holy Bible. This is what it's all about, because I'm here in San Antonio. I'm going to be going to the 4th of July. I'm going to the Alamo, and I'm going to give a tribute to the dead that are buried at the Alamo. There's over 1,000 Indians that are indigenous people that are buried there. There's over 400 Spaniards that are buried there, Tejanos. And there's also about 30 black slaves or black people that are buried at the Alamo. No one is speaking for them. People are making decisions about digging them out of a hole and throw them in another hole. That is sacrilegious, and it should not be done, and we'll talk about that in a minute.
Excellent. Jose, I had met you a couple of years ago, but I did not know all of your dedication and your incredible diligence in searching for many, many years, maybe decades, about your own family's history. You've told me something about the 433 and about the Spanish land grants. So you've mentioned a lot of things, two countries, one lie. Tell us a little bit more about how the history of these two countries got started and why it really was a misrepresentation of your history.
Well, I have been researching for over 30 years. For the last 7 years, I've been going all the way from South Texas, all the way up to the north, all the way to the east, to the west, as many places as I could. I'm a retired individual, and I have a fixed income, but I do the best I can. I've spent a lot of my own money going to tell the truth about what we have found. My family has been researching for many, many years, and we started back way back when I was in my 20s. I'm 73 now, so if you want to start looking like we did, it's going to take you a while to find all the information because most of it is buried. Rhett, you mentioned the 433, which I have a tattoo of right here on my arm here. I don't know how I can get this in here, but I have a 433 tattooed on my arm. And that 433 stands for the original land grant, be it Spanish or Mexican land grant originators. That's how Texas started when it was called Texas. When it was Texas, when it was owned by Mexico, it was a Spanish and a Mexican endeavor with our people that were mixed in. And right now, most people in Texas don't even know that they're probably a descendant. And I'm here to tell them that because of the way Texas has done us, that no one really understands because they didn't want you to know if you were a descendant. They didn't want you to know how you were connected to Spanish or Mexican land grants. But most of you probably were. Just San Antonio alone is 64% in what I consider Mexican-American indigenous people. And if you take that 64% of San Antonio, which is probably over 1 million people, you have to look at it realistically that 80 or 70 or 80% of those people are directly connected to Spanish and Mexican land grants. But yet if you walk up to them in the streets, they don't even know what you're talking about. Why? Because the Anglos did not want you to know that you had rights to these lands, that your lands were stolen. They didn't want you to talk about that. They wanted you to forget about it. So for the last maybe 75 or 100 years, you don't even know who we are anymore. I've been to universities in Texas and also in New Mexico, and I asked the kids, who are you? Where did you come from? And I get all kinds of different answers. And I'm looking at these kids, and they all tell me, well, I'm a Mexican, I'm Hispanic, I'm Latino, I'm Chicana. We don't even know what we are. We need to do something about that and become just like the Negroes were Negroes, and they didn't like that because that was a white man's identity. That's what we are. So we want to make sure that we all understand that what we need to do is not be recognized by what the white man wants or the Anglo, but what we want, what we think is right, what we think is fitting not only for the Tejanos, but also for the indigenous Mexican Americans. So we need to bring this all to a head. We need to get California involved, Nevada involved, Arizona involved, all the states that were on the border states when the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo went down. They need to be involved to speak for the real masses and not just keep allowing these people to tell you who you were and where you came from. They weren't here when we were here. Our ancestors were here hundreds of years before they even got here. And then when the Spaniards came in and started to infiltrate and started mixing the blood, and then the Europeans came in, it just got worse. It was more convoluted. But the reality of it is there's always been indigenous blood here. There's always been Aztec, there's been Mayans, there's been other tribes that are also in the same realm of indigenous blood that are mixed in with us. And the uniqueness of who we are and what we are has never been told. The story has never been unfolded because the Anglo doesn't want that. They want to have you spin what they've taught you in colleges and universities and high schools and junior highs. And we've been sort of twisted into a false history that really isn't ours.
Excellent, Jose. So do you think now, at this time in the 21st century, that the courts are more open, or even the new administration? Do you think there was a promise made during the Biden campaign that it was going to be different from the Trump administration? And you brought a treaty book, and I was shocked to find out about a convention and that was dealing with these issues as recently as 1941.
That's correct. That's correct. This book is called The Treaties of the United States. It's from the Library of Congress. This was a very difficult book to find, and it was very hard to even purchase. The reality of it is this. This is the story of what really happened to us in the three treaties that are the most important treaties to us. There have been many treaties, and I'll just share with you. There's at least 6, 7 that I can think of. But the three main treaties that affected the average Tejano or the average Mexican-American Indian has been the 1848 treaty, the 1923 treaty, and the 1941 treaty. They were called conventions or treaties. Convention is another word for treaty if you look it up. The reality of it is this. Those three treaties dealt with Texas specifically, not necessarily at the beginning where they dealt with all of us, but in general, the way we looked at these treaties, Texas was actually the cornerstone of where the issues are for most Mexicanos. And right now, I'm going to tell you that Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, we're going to get into it at a different forum here, but we're going to talk about that. But right now, I want to basically concentrate on the Alamo, but there is more to come about the injustices that have done to the Mexican American in the United States.
Excellent, thank you. And specifically about the Alamo, there's so many colorful stories and sad and tragic stories. Do you recall why that name came to stick when it prior the name had been Mission de Valero, the San Antonio? It's
gone through its transitions. It's had its own identity crisis. When it started out, it was basically a mission. And it was not built for a death or destruction kind of a location. It wasn't meant to be a fort or a fortress. It was a piece of God. It was a place of what I call prosperity and faith and those kind of things that a church usually has. But the Alamo was caught up in the middle of these fantastic situations like the Battle of 1836, where it had nothing to do with these people, but yet they used it as a footstool, so to speak, to establish whatever they wanted to do at the time, which was open rebellion against Mexico, and that's a whole different story. Again, Red, we can get into that at a later time, but right now I want to focus on the dead, because that's why I'm here. The Excellent. Tribute to the dead at the Alamo. I'm here to pay homage to them. On July 4th, I am going up there. I've been told that I will be arrested if I show up again. I'm going there because I have constitutional rights and I also have treaty rights. And the treaty rights say that I have the freedom of religion without restriction. And that is something different than this book, the U.S. Constitution. In here it says freedom of religion, but it does not say without restriction. This book, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, says without restriction. That means that no city ordinance, no state law or no federal law can intervene on my religious beliefs at the Alamo. I'm going to the Alamo on the 4th of July, Sunday. I'll be there around 1 o'clock, and I'm going to plan on praying for the dead. If that's a crime, then let them arrest me. I want to see that happen because I'm there for the dead, and I'm there for the buried, and I'm there to respect them. If they want to disrespect them by arresting me because I'm paying homage to them, then so be it. Let's get it on. Let's take it to the courts and let's see where they go with this. But I'm telling you right now that this treaty, Guadalupe Hidalgo, tells me that I have the right to be there without restrictions from anyone. And that's a treaty law. This is not a state issue. This is not a city issue. This is a federal issue between the U.S. government and the Mexican-American indigenous people of the state of Texas. And we're going to establish one thing and one thing for all, that the United States has to get back and redress the wrong that has been done here in Texas and also the other states for what they did to us with the Treaty Guadalupe Hidalgo and also the 1923 treaty and the 1941 treaty, where there was a first time ever reparations created in 1941 that gave Mexico $193 million for the stolen lands of the Tejanos of 1848. And that money was given to Mexico, which was in today's money around $4 to $10 billion. In today's money, they kept the money. They said they were going to pay it back. They declared that they were going to pay it back, but Mexico never paid us back. And guess what? There was no language in the treaty in 1941 that would punish Mexico for not doing what it's supposed to do, taking the $193 million at 1923 money and giving it to the Tejanos from that treaty. There was no language by the United States to protect its own citizens. And this is a violation of our 5th and 14th Amendments that people need to understand. I'll get into later on about the lawsuits and all that stuff, but this reality is one thing right here, right now. The fight is on for our dead at the Alamo, and that's what this is going to be all about. And we're going there on the 4th of July of 2021, and I'm going to take a stand for those people and the rest of the living and the dead. And I'm going to stand there and challenge the United States to reconvene and get involved with possibly bringing Mexico back into this, because they are the one that negotiated for our ancestors and their descendants, of which I am one. So this is going to be a big magnitude of a problem for the United States, Texas, and San Antonio.
Excellent. Thank you for relating that incredible history. You had mentioned earlier, and I had mentioned as well, that a number of burials at the Alamo prior to the Battle of the Alamo, and this was quite a large cemetery, evidently, because maybe approximately 1,500 burials there, and that's just that the church documented, because the downtown San Antonio area was, of course, a Native American site before there was an Alamo, before there was any kind of mission there at all. But so, and you enumerated some of the graves. I've over many years, I've lived in San Antonio since 1992, so approximately 28, 29 years. But and I visited here as a child. I lived in a small town in North Texas, and I don't recall them ever talking about that there was a large cemetery that probably was the setting. In other words, there must have been graves. I don't know if there were markers for graves, but the Battle of the Alamo must have occurred. Part of that battle must have occurred right on the cemetery. The way I understand where the cemetery would have been laid out. And, of course, there's the cenotaph, as you know, that giant marker, a giant commemoration there that's really literally said to be an empty tomb, that there were no ashes or anything inside the cenotaph, but it was a tribute to some of those that fought at the Alamo. So, what is an appropriate way for, our nation, our local government, to acknowledge these graves and to respect, as you said, we want to commemorate and remember everyone that's buried there?
It all starts, Rhett, by respecting and recognizing the rights of even the littlest minorities in this country, what the Constitution was based on. And right now, I can tell you, I've been to Williamsburg, Virginia, and I saw those, how they buried their dead back in the 1600s. And they were all buried near a church. That was the custom back 400 or 500 years ago. And when somebody tells me about the Alamo, well, where are they buried? You got to remember, they've been burying the dead there way before the Alamo was even built. This was a known area of where the dead were placed. But once it became a church, that's what Williamsburg did. They buried everybody near the churches. As a matter of fact, I even went to a church in Williamsburg where they're buried right in front of the door. When you walk in to the church, you walk in past all these tombstones. So this is not unusual. What's unusual is the United States, San Antonio, and Texas refuses to recognize them. You go to Williamsburg, and that's all sanctuary there. That's sanctimonious, but because they're white people that are buried there. You come to Texas, they're just Indians, or they're just black people, or they're just Mexicans. Nobody cares. Somebody should care. That's why I'm here. Somebody should care, and that's the respect that needs to start to be shown to all of us in this country, including the Mexican Americans. I hope that answers your question about some of the history of the dead, because this is not an anomaly. This is the way it was 500 years ago. People were buried at cemeteries or they were buried at churches. So here we are, 400 years later, since when they started burying people at the Alamo grounds, and here we are discussing about they want to uproot everybody and move them all to a different hole so they can throw them all in together. I went to a grave that somebody had taken me to in San Antonio, where they had 27 dead Indians dug up at the Alamo and poured in one hole. How disrespectful can you be? Now, if that had been 27 Anglos, oh, hell would have broke loose. You would have seen everybody outraged there, and how dare you do that? But all of a sudden, just because they're Indians or Mexicans, nobody cares. I care. I think it's wrong, and I think the country should think it's wrong, and I think it needs to be talked about. This conversation needs to start today.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you again. For many years, and maybe some of our viewers remember over the years that we've produced this show, that sometimes I refer to something, a period of history and I don't know if it's an international treaty, but it's certainly an era that began with the so-called exploration discovery period of the whole world, and that was around about the 15th century. Of course, Christopher Columbus was part of that movement, but what I call the smoking gun of history regarding that period were actual letters of patent and papal bulls that were issued during that time period, and starting, say, mid 15th century up until the 16th century. So the so-called doctrine of discovery was something that the popes frequently talked about. So we could look that up. Certainly, you can Google search that. And you've probably heard of it yourself. So it was a series of these letters of patent or whatever, and it more or less authorized exactly what you're talking about, that somehow people that were agents of these Christian, the kings that were recognized by the Pope, these agents could sail around the world and lay claim to the whole planet as long as it hadn't been claimed by some other Christian king. And so this is quite alarming, and you're thinking, okay, in all these confrontations, which many were violent, brutal, horrific, and why is there no redress? And I think that's what we're talking about here is if indigenous persons were violated or never respected, how is that going to be addressed now? How can we start talking in that conversation?
I think this opportunity that you have given us, Rhett, on your show has opened that door. I think this opportunity is out there waiting to happen. And yes, the Joe Biden administration is front and foremost at the middle of this. He doesn't know yet, but it's coming. The reality of it is this, Brett. It's going to be people like you and others who are recognizing the wrongs and the ills that have been done to the Mexican-American community. And now we need to start opening up the discussion about how to right the wrong. The redress is from all of the wrong that has been done to these poor people. If you go out in there like I do every day here in San Antonio, and I see these poor, desperate people that have been robbed of their opportunities, had they stayed on their lands and the Anglos wouldn't have stolen their lands, they'd be all having wealth and fame and fortune, and we'd be a different type of people. But that opportunity was stolen from us, and it was taken from us by a bunch of people that were carpetbaggers here in Texas 170 years ago, and they got away with it. Why? Because they could. They took over a vulnerable people. They took over these poor Mexican Americans who were Mexican nationals at the time, who couldn't write or read or even speak English, and all of a sudden find themselves in a foreign land where the Anglos are the ones that are in charge, where the Anglos are the ones that are writing out titles and deeds and patents and changing everything on the fly and making people put an X down. They didn't even know what they were signing for. They intimidated, they coerced, they hung, they shot thousands of Mexican people to get what they wanted, the land. And that's what this fight is about. The redress of the land. And we're coming after the federal government, and we want the federal government to know that they've got a responsibility to do something about the wrong that has been done here, not only from the state of Texas, not only from San Antonio, but also all the way through the United States on all of these poor people that have lost and never been given the decency or the chance to state their case. I want to tell you that this is changing, and hopefully with your help and more TV shows, we'll be able to acknowledge more.
Great, Jose. Thank you very, very much. And I'm thinking, of course, that the Department of Interior, many of you probably know, this is the first Native American, I believe, and I can't remember the lady's full name, Hayland or something. She's from the Navajo tribes or something from, I guess, Arizona, New Mexico, at any rate. So there's even been talk of turning over all the government land or some of the government land, like national parks, back to the Native Americans. And I think a large part, many acres that were in formerly Oklahoma now have been designated as from the treaty, the Native American treaties, the reservations there. So do you think that, under Joe Biden's administration or some part of that there's some allies inside the government or here in town that would help with this project? If
there isn't, we're going to find them.
Good.
So we'll do whatever we can.
Excellent, excellent.
I think we're good.
All right, so that concludes our show. We want to bring you many more shows on our new reincarnation of the post-pandemic public access television in San Antonio, World Peace. Thank you again, and we'll hope to see you next week.